Hello, everyone. My name is David Valcarcel, and today I want to explore a question that people have been asking for a very long time. Where does language actually come from? Is it something we're born with? Is it mostly learned from our parents and teachers? Or is it somewhere in between? I don't have all the answers, but over the semester, I've been looking closely at the research, and right now the evidence has led me towards the idea that language is largely innate, meaning our brains come from basic hardware or grammar. Culture and upbringing still matter a lot. I mean, they decide whether you speak English or Spanish and those kinds of things. But the core ability to use grammar, in my opinion, may be built in. I'm looking at this from a speech pathology perspective because how we answer this question affects how we help kids with language delays or even adults who experience language loss later on in life. I want to walk through what I found, and also I want to be honest about what we still don't know. Let's get started. First, there are really three main views on where language comes from. First, the learned behavior view. This says language is like basically you imitate adults, get rewarded, and eventually you figure it out. Second, the innate view, which is people like Pinker who argue we're born with some kind of like language organ in the brain. Grammar just grows naturally. Third, which is the middle ground, where most researchers today agree that both nature and nurture matter. And I agree with that too. I agree with that perspective. But based on a lot of studies I've read, and I think that the core, most important part is that the language is innate. Your brain has something to learn language, or it won't happen. One analogy that I liked, where in one of the resources I looked at, was how a computer needs an operating system before you can install apps. And of course, the operating system is innate, and the apps are just like the language they learn, so like English or Spanish. To explore this question, I want to look at four areas of evidence. And the first one is genetics. Research has actually found specific genes involved in building the brain's language circuit. Second is neurology. We found brain areas that seem to care specifically about grammar. One of which is of course Broca's area. Third is the critical period. There appears to be like this biological window for learning language. And if you miss it, full recovery can be very hard. And fourth, which is something called the poverty of the stimulus, which was just a way in the resources that I've looked at where it's saying kids figure out rules that no one ever taught them. Let me explain each one and also point out where each evidence has limits. So let's start with genetics. This was some of the most surprising evidence. So, for example, on some of the resources I've seen, there's a family in London called the King family. 15 people across three generations all have significant trouble with speech and grammar. They might say, the boy eat instead of the boy eats. They also struggle to make the clear speech sounds. But the interesting part is that their intelligence for everything else is normal. They can solve puzzles, hold jobs, but they just can't master grammar. Scientists track this to a single mutation in the gene called FOXP2. One small change in DNA, and that language, can break. To check that this wasn't a fluke, I also saw another study found with a second family with a different mutation in FOXP2, and it was the same exact pattern. Where honestly, this just shows that language isn't just like learned, but it has a huge biological element to it. But also, FOXP2 isn't like a language gene. It's involved in brain development more broadly, but still, this evidence is pretty interesting. FOXP2 doesn't also do stuff by itself. There's also other genes that have affected this, including one called CNT-NAP2. Here's why this like matters clinically. These variations in CNT-NAP2 can predict how well a person can repeat nonsense words, like I don't know, Blonterstape, stuff like that. Speech pathologists use this task all the time. Non-word repetition is a reliable marker actually for specific language impairment, SLI. So there's a possible line from a gene to a specific clinical test, which can hint at precision medicine for language disorders. The same genetic region has also been linked to language delays and autism. This suggests different disorders might share some biological pathways, but we're still early in some of the research that I've read. Now let's look at the brain. One study I found, which was very interesting, was how researchers taught German adults two types of rules. One set were real grammar rules from Italian and Japanese, rules that followed what Chomsky calls universal grammar, right? And the other set used the same words but followed impossible rules, where they don't occur in any human language. And then they use an fMRI to see which brain areas were active. When people learned the real grammar rules, Broca's area lit up. When they tried to learn impossible rules, there was no activation. Which is very interesting because this basically suggests that Broca's area isn't like a general like learning center, but it's specialized for grammar. That it's very interesting how that happens. But we should also note that fMRI shows correlation, but not exact proof. So if that's the case, then what happens when Broca's area is damaged? In speech pathology, it's the term we call this Broca's aphasia, where patients speak in like short, choppy sentences where it's like dog, bark, yesterday, and they drop like little words like the and is, and also endings like ed and ing. But the key is that they can still name objects though. They point to a cat and they say cat. Vocabulary is there, but the grammar is apart. It's a separate thing, which is like this is called a double dissociation, where one part of the brain handles grammar and the other handles vocabulary. For clinicians, this suggests that if a patient has Broca's aphasia, targeting grammar directly may help more than general communication strategies. But of course, every patient is different, and I want to look at more research where we find out like what works best for different people. Now, let's talk about the critical period, where it's the idea of a biological window for learning language. Well, from this, I basically learned how like newborns are amazing. Like they can hear every sound from every human language. A baby can hear the difference between rock and lock, which and even by babies who are from like different places, right? Like or let's say like a Japanese baby can hear the difference between rock and lock, which that does not exist in Japanese. But by about 12 months, that ability is mostly gone. The brain has like committed to the sounds of the native language. And if a child misses language entirely until after puberty, there's a lot of tragic cases of Jeannie and Victor that you can never fully recover grammar. Vocabulary can be taught, grammar, but grammar full, fluent grammar, it will seem gone. Learned skills usually don't have expiration dates. Instincts actually usually do, and that pattern just supports how language is innate, even though these are rare case studies, not like controlled experiments. The last pillar is my favorite because it's kind of counterintuitive. Think about how kids like learn past tense. They hear like I walked, like I jumped, okay, but they never hear like I goed. No parent says that, like no one. But around age 3, every typical child who's developing will say I go. Now, where did that rule come from? They aren't imitating. I mean, their brain figured out the ed rule and over applied it. Then around age 5, they learned go as an exception and then went switched back to went. The input was like it was too messy and incomplete to fully explain what the child did. The child's brain then filled in the gaps. That's what the poverty the stimulus argument is. And honestly, it's one of the strongest pieces of evidence for that innate grammatical template. Um, Now I want to talk about the counter argument. But of course, someone might say, "But David, we clearly learn our specific language from our parents. Doesn't that prove language is learned?" And I agree. Of course, vocabulary is learned, accent is learned, slang, politeness, routines, right? Social things like that. Um, but what doesn't seem to be learned is like the ability to like form questions, mark past tense, embed clauses. Every child in every culture just figures those out. So I think that kind of argument that I've seen in some of the resources I've looked at kind of misses what the main point can be, is that culture determines which language you speak, and biology just determines whether you speak at all. and the environmental triggers the instinct, which it doesn't create from scratch. I realize I said that biology determines where you speak at all. I meant like as in fully understanding language. That's what I meant. Um, Now I also want to talk about some interesting things about like the clinical implications of this. Where because for speech pathologists, there are real implications of of this research. Well, for assessment is one thing. So if a child has SLI, we shouldn't assume like there's a general cognitive delay. If we target specific grammatical structures, like non-word repetition tasks, which was seen before, might help screen for CNT NAP2 related issues, like we talked about before. Another implication we have is for treatment. So a child with a FOXP2 mutation may need therapy that targets both speech motor planning and grammar together. For example, a patient with Broca's aphasia might also benefit from direct grammar therapy. And the critical period, which we talked about before, means early intervention is crucial, you know. And finally, for prognosis, some patients may never fully recover grammar due to biological constraints. And, obviously we need to like work on the location of brain damage, age, and genetic profile to fully come to a conclusion to help those people. So, for conclusions, let me summarize what I found. So, obviously, there's the four pillars of evidence, which is genetics, with FOXP2, CNT, NAP2, neurology about Broca's area and Broca's aphasia, the critical period, which we talk about also in the researching class, and also poverty of the stimulus. The bottom line from the research I've read is that culture has a big part in which language you speak, and also like sometimes the way you view things. But biology determines whether you actually understand the innate, like you understand the language, like that it's innate. I think that Steven Pinker said it well, in my opinion. Knowing how to speak is as natural to humans as knowing how to weave a web is it to a spider. No one teaches a spider to weave. No one teaches a child to acquire grammar. Both come from biological readiness. But of course, that said, I'm open to new evidence. I mean, science, moves forward by questioning everything that's happening. So, but this is just this kind of thing just appealed to me. These are peer-reviewed studies from journals like Nature, Neural, and Cognition. The full list is on the screen. And um, yeah, thank you so much. I'll then move on to the reflection. Hello. When I started this class, I honestly thought that language is mostly learned, right? Where babies listen and copy and figure it out, and that seemed like common sense. But honestly, this semester kind of flipped my understanding, which was really just like I've never been exposed to Pinker and stuff like that. And the three biggest surprises were actually this. First, the genetics. I had no idea we actually found a gene for language, which was very interesting. The KE family, where 15 people with a single mutation that breaks grammar but leaves intelligence intact, is pretty shocking. And it changed how I think about kids with language delays, where they aren't, they're not less smart. Their language hardware is just different. Second, which is the critical period, which I learned in class as well as for this presentation. I knew it was harder to learn a language as an adult. I mean, of course, but like an infant losing the ability to hear rock versus lock by 12 months, which is pretty interesting. Where the brain never is just a blank state, like it's not. And the third is the poverty of the stimulus, where the example of the goat and went, which was talked about in Pinker as well, like it's just showing off like the innate grammar like generator, you know. But am I completely convinced? I mean, mostly yeah, but like of course there are gaps. Like we don't fully understand like how FOXP2 like builds the neural circuits, right? In the brain. Or not in the brain, sorry, in genetics. And we don't know how to reopen the critical period like after like a stroke or something like that. Like something that affects the adult later on in life. But through my lens that I used because I was doing this through a speech pathologist perspective, I learned that language is not like one thing. It's like a collection, right? It's a collection of subsystems. It's phonology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, I think, yeah, primary, and each can break independently. So this can obviously be used to like specialize like what neural adaptations we can work with like with the patient. Finally, I learned that speech language pathology isn't just about like just teaching, right? Teaching skills. It's about understanding the biology and respecting like what the brain's constraints are, and working within them. I mean, I think that's just a really interesting thing to do, especially in this modern age. Um, it's very humble, like a very humble and more exciting way to practice. I think when you're connecting with that person. And I think that's it. Thank you. This class has generally changed how I see language, the brain, and it's very interesting. I'm sorry that I sound like this because I've been sick for the past 3 days and I'm unable to work on this anymore due to going out of the state in like a couple hours. So, but I've written the script for a long time. Just I've been trying to find the time to write, to say the actual script. All right. Thank you and have a good day.